Good morning. I'm delighted that you're able to join us at this webinar, Business Challenges and the New Age of Work. For those of you that don't know me, I am Robert Bean, Managing Partner at Grunberg & Co. We are joined today by Samantha Randall of Palmers Solicitors, and she will be speaking about various topics regarding remote working and the end of the pandemic. It's been a challenging year for everyone. After surveying our team here at Grunberg & Co, we have decided to implement a fully agile working policy so that the staff have the flexibility as to where and how to work. We have full trust in our team, but obviously the needs of the business and our clients come first. So they would have to be in the office as and when required. Communication, both internally and externally, is the key to ensuring this policy works. Please use the Q&A panel to ask any questions. The webinar will be recorded and available later to watch. I will now hand over to Samantha, who will be discussing this in more detail.
Thank you, Robert. And so what I'm going to be speaking about during this webinar is office working versus home working, and we're having a look at managing staff remotely and a couple of wellbeing issues. We'll then move on to remote work, remote recruiting and training. And finally, we finish up with a topic on vaccination policies. So obviously lockdown has brought a whole host of surprises, challenges and changes all over the country, but obviously most prevalent has been to home working. In the short term, as lockdown restrictions ease, many employees may continue to work from home or during a phased return to the workplace. So it's likely that employees will find that there's a bit of a mix between virtual working and physical working for some time to come. During this time, organisations need to ensure that there's fairness and consistency across the treatment of their employees, whether they are working flexible or not, as well as ongoing communication and engagement. So what can businesses do following this period of enforced home working? And how can they review the potential benefits to the organisation, but also to their employees as well? Now, there is a wide range of research and strong evidence to show that flexibility can support inclusion, help reduce the gender pay gap, and support sustainability initiatives, as well as attracting and retaining talent across a wider geographical area, together with the obvious of an increase in productivity and supporting staff wellbeing. So moving on, we will have a look at managing requests in the short term. So many employees are going to have a short to medium term need for flexible working over the next couple of months as a result of the pandemic. For example, they may be living with a health condition that makes them especially vulnerable, or they may be struggling to balance work and childcare, or they may have ongoing care and responsibilities. In these circumstances, it may not be helpful to follow a normal policy or process for flexible working. Employers might find themselves in positions of having to consider several flexible working requests at the same time, and therefore ACAS has published some guidance which makes the following suggestions. So employers are not required to make value judgments about who is most deserving of a flexible working request, and each request should be looked at on its own individual merits in the context of the business. Requests should be considered in the order that they are received, and it may be possible to grant them all. However, before making any decision, the employee needs to consider what the impact of agreeing to that change will be on the business, and to have that in regard when agreeing to subsequent changes. So the employer might well want to have a discussion with the employees who have made requests to see whether there can be some compromise to at least agree more of the requests rather than simply refusing them. If this solution doesn't work, then it might well have to consider looking at those who are already working flexibly to consider whether there are any adjustments can be made so that this can be accommodated for everyone. But essentially, the overriding requirement for the employer is to deal with the request for flexible working in a reasonable manner. And it's important that employers be consistent with individual requests when they receive multiple requests in one go. So where an employer is trying to deal with several flexible working requests in one go, it obviously needs to take account of the particular features of a flexible working request, such as caring obligations and accommodating any disabilities, which might limit the employee's ability to vary or amend their request. Despite the suggestion that employers may make value judgments about requests and deal with them just in the order that they are received, it's almost inevitable that employers will prioritise those employees who have additional protection in the form of either being able to bring a disability discrimination claim if their request is then rejected. Moving on to the next slide, we have a look at addressing the short-term needs of the employee. So going back to obviously the flexible working request in the short term or for a time-limited change, rather than go through a formal flexible working process under the statutory regime, an employer might consider sort of laxing some of these policies to allow a bit more flexibility in the request that they allow. So this could be allowing employees to request temporary changes to their working pattern, for example, for a 3 to 6 month period. And at the end of any agreed period, they're then resuming back to their normal substantive working pattern. There could be a shorter application process, for example, aiming to make decisions in a short period of time and making the application process as simple and straightforward as possible. There could be additional changes, such as removing any usual policy requirements, such as the requirement for 26 weeks service before any request can be made by an employee, or allowing more than one request in any 12-month period. So these are a couple of changes that can be made, particularly if you're going to be dealing with a lot of requests in one go. Essentially, any change should be mutually agreed, confirmed in writing, and have a clear end date if it is a temporary change. If the employee, however, is seeking a more permanent change, then the usual flexible working policy and arrangement should apply in this case. Moving on to the next slide, we have a look at the actual return to the workplace. So in the short term, flexible working might actually support the return to the normal workplace. It's likely that we're going to be living with the risks of COVID-19 for many months to come, and there will likely to be limitations on public transport or staff fearing the use of public transport, either in order to maintain social distancing and obviously to limit the number of people in an office at any one time. The following forms of flexible working can therefore support social distancing, help maintain hygiene, and therefore support a safe return to the workplace. So some examples can include home working, obviously, staggered hours. So this might be where an employee staggers their shifts so that there are less people coming in the office for the same period of time. Either compressed hours, which is typical in terms of instead of working 5 days a week, you work the same hours in 4 days. Adjusted shift rotas, again, just to stop so many people being in the office at any one time. Or another alternative may be working any 5 days for 7. And this obviously would mean that your employer would need to be open at weekends as well. Moving on to the next slide about how an employer can actually make this work in practice. So essentially, and you'll see, which will be a running theme throughout this webinar, is that it's very much going to be underpinned on trust and good communication, which is going to be vital to ensure that these arrangements work. It's ultimately a balance between being flexible but also facilitating cooperation. Setting out clear expectations from an employer's perspective as to what is required and what is expected, and ensuring that employers can measure work and output as they won't have that face-to-face contact. Moving on to the next slide. Obviously, once these changes have been agreed, then there is a need to potentially change employment contracts as well. As some of the arrangements might differ from what's set out in the contract. It's important that employers do not make any unilateral changes without the consent of their employees, as this could ultimately amount to a breach of contract, even if it was just a temporary change. Even when a contract has a clause that allows flexibility, it's always best, obviously, to get the employee's consent, and care should be taken with such clauses, so that they're used in a way that's reasonable and doesn't discriminate against other employees who may have a protected characteristic. So depending on the nature of the change, the employer may well need to seek legal advice on the specific contract. And there are several ways that a contract may be changed, but obviously the most effective way is by agreement. And therefore, any employees or employers who wish to introduce changes should ideally communicate those proposals clearly to their employees, including any of those who are on furlough leave, include any relevant trade unions or representatives, and also seek feedback from their employees as well about any changes. So the specific circumstances of the employee should always be taken into account. Some employees, as I said, might be unable to vary their arrangements due to childcare or family responsibilities, so care should be taken to not discriminate against these individuals. Following any feedback that you've gathered, the proposal should ideally be set out in writing and communicated to the employee and their express consent. So where an agreement is reached, the employers may implement these changes, and should they keep any new working patterns under review and be prepared to change them in case government guidance changes as well. Where the employee does not agree to the change, however, there are a couple of options available to an employer, including proposing a unilateral change of their existing terms and then offering re-engagement on any new terms. However, this is ultimately a last resort and care should be taken and potentially legal advice sought before any action is taken in this regard. Moving on to the next slide, we then have a look at policy, and obviously in light of the fact that Grunberg have also implemented a new policy in agile working, this is very much going to be a relevant section for most employers who are looking to make changes to their policies in the future. So any change to the approach of flexible working, whether that's in the short term or long term, may need a policy review. And it's likely these policies are going to be kept under review depending on the circumstances and changing government guidance. So where the policy only follows the statutory procedure, which would be a normal flexible working policy, the full benefits of that flexible working may not be realised. For example, the law on flexible working only permits applications from those employees who have served 26 weeks service with that company. And therefore, particularly for new employees joining the company, they might well be discouraged from joining if they have to work a period of 6 months before they get this benefit. So there is currently proposals in government for the legislation to change on flexible working to allow effectively a flex for all, which could remove this requirement completely and allow flexible working requests to be submitted from day one of employment. Other policy changes might include advertising roles as flexible, so that more applications from a wider population are interested in potentially applying for those roles, and to obviously make the application process a bit more simpler in completing a more straightforward form, and having an automatic consideration for transferring any flexible working into other roles, whether they are internally or promotions. And obviously, as I said, considering a shorter time scale for considering any requests. So it's really just a case of reviewing those policies. As I said, particularly if an employer is going to be dealing with a lot of requests in any one time. So coming on to managing staff remotely. Most employers have had to have months of experience in remote working to keep employees productive and engaged, but many view remote working as a temporary situation still. Despite this, remote working seems very much here to stay. The shift required managers to ensure that their employees get the requisite support and to tackle the emotional rollercoaster that has been the pandemic, and to ensure that they are productive and engaged. This guidance hasn't changed. In fact, it's become more crucial now, given that the pandemic has endured for so long. So moving on to our next slide, we have a look at how you can effectively manage staff remotely. So we've got a couple of tips outlined here. So the first, obviously, be on the lookout for any signs of distress. Again, communication with your employees is going to be key in this regard to ensure that you notice any changes in their behaviour. Second point is obviously to equip your employees and make sure that they have all the technology that they require to be successful. It could be more than a laptop or a mobile phone. For example, if you've got employees attending video calls, do they have adequate cameras and things like that as well? And it's just acknowledging that virtual communications are different, so it's not going to be perfect, but everyone should still be professional and respectful of others, but be mindful that virtual communication may be less comfortable and effective for some, and to coach employees on when and how to escalate ineffective virtual exchanges. For example, if you haven't settled an issue in 6 emails, then it might be worth elevating that to a meeting to kind of get things wrapped up instead. Another tip is obviously just to promote dialogue, ensuring that there is good communication between managers and employees, to ensure that staff feel that they have people to talk to, that they still feel part of a team, just because, you know, working at home can be isolating sometimes. And then the next point, just in regards to trusting your employees, as I said, a lot of the flexible working scheme is very much going to be underpinned on trust and confidence in your staff to do the right thing. So it's very easy for managers to be concerned or frustrated to lose that visibility, but they need to ensure that they don't respond by then micromanaging their staff, because that will only serve to disengage and fatigue already stressed out employees. So it's a case of not fixating on perceived performance problems, as we'll all have plenty of time to learn on established performance management systems over the next coming months. And it's a case of reinforcing those organisational values. So just because staff are working from home, they are still part of that business and they still represent the company. So it's keeping them organisational values well communicated during that period. And using the objectives to create clarity as well. So it's very easy for role definitions to fall apart during any period of disruption, leaving employees unsure of where their focus is or what they should be accomplishing. So it's important that employees feel confident about the importance of their job, how it impacts on the success of the overall company, so they then feel less anxious about their own job security if they can see that their role is making a difference to the company as a whole. And again, it's focusing on the outputs and not process. In the remote landscape where many people are juggling work and family commitments in their own homes, enabling employees to complete their work in ways that are easiest and most productive for them. And this then empowers a team to complete assignments in their own way. And obviously increasing recognition as well. So, I mean, during periods of disruption, employees' desire to be recognised for their work and their contribution only increases. And effective recognition not only motivates employees, but also serves as a strong signal to other employees of the behaviours that they should emulate as well. Recognition doesn't always need to be monetary. Consider public acknowledgement, tokens of appreciation, development opportunities. Particularly if a business has slowed down, this is obviously the perfect opportunity for any kind of personal development opportunities as well. And then lastly, obviously encouraging innovation still. Understandably, managers and employees might become a bit more risk averse during these uncertain times, and there's a natural hesitancy among employees to not be disruptive or try something new, but this is the perfect time to really sort of take risks and push yourself. And so that innovative ability should still be pushed and enhanced during that time. Moving on to our next section, we have a quick look at staff wellbeing. Obviously, the pandemic has seen businesses adopt flexible working practices like remote working at an unprecedented rate. Not only does this protect the workforce and business continuity from a health and safety point of view to curb the outbreak, but home and remote working can mean people avoid lengthy commutes and have fewer distractions than if they were in the office. But it can also result in people overworking sometimes and feeling isolated. So there is a very much a focus on the health and well-being of employees during this time. It's very easy to log on quite early, work through your lunches, work later on into the evening, and no one is there to stop you. So it's very important to have an eye on your employees' health and well-being during this time. As an employer, you have the same duty of care to staff during this pandemic as you do at any other time. So it's important that you are supportive of your team. So a couple of things that you can do as an employer to support staff wellbeing, coming back to, again, good communication and ensuring that any updates are communicated to staff so that they are kept in the loop with any changes. You might want to consider rotating any high stress areas of work and low stress functions so that there's a bit of a mix for employees. And maybe to partner inexperienced workers with more experienced workers so that there's a buddy system effectively to provide support, monitor stress and reinforce any safety procedures. Encouraging monitor breaks and normal rest breaks is going to be essential as well. As I said, it's very easy just to work through your lunches, but to implement any kind of flexible schedules, particularly if those employees are affected by a stressful event or a family member, particularly obviously during the pandemic, a lot of people have lost people. So it's having that flexibility and understanding there during these times. And that you ensure that your colleagues are there to support each other as well. You know, as I said, it's very easy to feel isolated when you're working at home on your own, but you are still part of a wider team, so it's important that you keep contact with them. And ensure that your employees are aware that there are support services out there that they can go to as well. So moving on to our second topic, we are taking a look at remote recruiting and training. So remote recruiting is on the rise across Europe. Although the practice of remote hiring is still fairly new for businesses, remote hiring requires companies to adjust the key elements of their recruitment process in updating their policies and investing in relevant technology. These modifications help to ensure that firms enjoy successful remote hiring and appoint people capable of making a real impact in a remote working environment. The ongoing pandemic has obviously forced companies to consider remote hiring. However, the number of people working remotely was increasing anyway, but has only been accelerated as a result of the pandemic. Businesses of all sizes continue to take advantage of new technologies to offer remote working opportunities, and the advantages of a remote or agile workforce are already well documented. So things like increased productivity, a positive impact on employees' own health and well-being, a significant saving cost, obviously cutting out that commute time and any train fees or petrol, and ensuring that you can actually recruit from a larger and more diverse talent pool, because you might be recruiting employees who live further afield that wouldn't have thought to apply due to a long commute, for example. So in terms of what best you can do, moving on to the next slide, in terms of, it's going to be a case of preparing for their start date well in advance so that you can make sure that their transition into the company goes as smoothly as possible. So the things include ordering any equipment a week before they start, asking your IT department to get them set up and sorted so that there is a smooth start to their work and that there's any technical issues, and make them feel welcome. So this is obviously a great time to send out any company branded welcome packs and ensuring that they feel part of the team from the outset. So this could include sending out your employee handbook, communicating the company's values and what their missions are, photos of the team that they'll be working in, if it weren't for COVID, and any other kind of merchandise that you have, just to make them feel part of a team. And you might well ask your current team to carry out a Zoom meetings, just so everyone can put a face to a name, essentially. And encourage the new employee to work with in a group during their onboarding, just because collaborative learning works much better. And again, it might be a case of adopting a buddy system so that they can be monitored and have that support system there, that they've got someone to go to if there's any issues. Because obviously it's daunting enough starting a new job when you're physically there, but it must be even more so when you're doing so remotely. And also setting targets and expectations. So it's important for employees to understand what their short-term and long-term goals are. This could be developing a shared diary system or calendar, defining targets and how they'll be measured, planning any kind of weekly, monthly or annual team meetings or performance evaluations, and ensure that they have met their line manager and any other key staff in the organisation so that they can put names to faces. And it's also about having a robust training programme. So remote training can be a bit more complex than in-person training, especially as communication is limited. But it's ensuring that you've got a mix of different training approaches and materials to appeal to different learning styles, make it interactive and user-friendly, use videos, live streams to keep it interesting, to keep staff engaged. And have other staff get involved as well, as that's normally the best way of learning from others who have already been through the same. Moving on to the next slide. As we said, it's a running theme throughout this. Communication is key, no matter what. So, as I said, remote working can be lonely, and your new employee might feel isolated from time to time, especially as they don't know anyone properly. So it's all about increasing your communication with remote employees, making sure that they're aware of the support around them and how they can utilise that. Perhaps introduce them to LinkedIn, let them know the communication tools that are around, and maybe even arrange social events and regular team meetings so they can continue to feel engaged. Moving on to our final topic, we then have a quick whistle-stop tour on vaccination policies. So this is a topic that I could probably go on for, but I'll keep it as brief as I can. That essentially the UK is obviously right in the middle of rolling out their vaccination programme at the moment. The government hasn't released any guidance on vaccination for employers, but existing case law gives us a bit of an idea as to how we can approach these issues. Now, the first question really on our next slide is going to be looking at, are there any circumstances in which an employer can require an employee to have a vaccination? So we already know that vaccinations are highly effective in protecting people, which could easily tempt employees to require workers to get vaccinated. However, as I said, the government has not legislated for the vaccine to be mandatory. So on balance, it's going to be quite risky for an employer to insist on vaccination, even if the employee works in a close contact with vulnerable people, such as in the social care sector. ACAS guidance effectively says that employers should be supporting staff to get the vaccine and detail the benefits of this, but shouldn't be enforcing it upon them. However, in the future, it might be necessary to make the vaccination mandatory for someone to do their job, particularly if they travel overseas and they need to be vaccinated to do so. Our next question is then looking at what might an employee object to a vaccination and what issues an employer is going to face having objected. So the reasons are going to vary from anything from a lack of confidence in the safety of a vaccination to being opposed to vaccination in general. And as we know, any available vaccine might not be suitable for all, and therefore there are a number of factors that employees or employers need to consider before rolling out any vaccination policy. A couple of factors is going to be age. Obviously, the rollout is based on age at the moment. So older workers are more likely to have the vaccination already, whereas younger workers might not have been offered one yet. Disability is going to be another key area in this regard. Some individuals have been advised not to have the vaccine because of a medical condition, and they might be considered as disabled under the Equality Act, and therefore choosing not to get the vaccine could be seen as something arising from a disability. Another category, those who are pregnant or planning to get pregnant. The vaccination is currently not recommended for those pregnant, breastfeeding or planning to get pregnant. So it's going to be how you deal with those employees. And then religion and belief is going to be another big area. Certain religions or have moral objections to the vaccine could be protected as a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. For example, gelatine is derived from pigs and is often used in mass production of vaccinations, which could obviously cause a problem for some religious groups as well as vegans or vegetarian employees. And it's important to remember that ethical veganism has been found as a belief that could potentially amount to a protected characteristic. And someone's anti-vaccination position could also amount to a protected philosophical belief under the Equality Act as well. So these are all different factors to be aware of before any policies are rolled out, as the policy itself might be therefore indirectly discriminatory unless it can be justified. Various exceptions might therefore need to be carved out in respect of these categories. For example, if an employer was looking to roll out the policy on vaccinations, then there's a question of how those who are not vaccinated are going to be treated. And for example, whether it's appropriate for them to continue with protective measures or consider redeployment, and the potential discrimination of whether or not that's appropriate. Moving on to our next question. Can an employee therefore be dismissed for refusing the vaccination? So as a whole, failure to follow a reasonable management instruction can lead to a fair dismissal, and most likely would be a dismissal on the grounds of some other substantial reason. Whilst there's yet to be any case law on this point, a tribunal is likely to have sympathy on an employee who didn't want to get the vaccine, and was then dismissed or disciplined as a result of that. So it's likely that a tribunal would be reluctant to find that it's fair to impose what's effectively a medical procedure on an employee, notwithstanding their basic human right. However, the nature of the workplace might be a relevant factor depending on the situation. So in view of the risks of a mandatory vaccination programme, it's advisable for employers to consider how best to achieve voluntary vaccination. Every employer has a duty to take reasonable care for the health and safety of their employees under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and therefore this includes carrying out risk assessments, implementing any measures to minimise the risk of transmission. So therefore encouraging and enabling vaccination is going to be a key step in minimising transmission in the workplace, which goes towards the overall health and safety. Moving on to the next slide, we then ask the question of, can an employer require an employee to disclose whether or not they have been vaccinated or not? Now, this gives rise to a couple of issues. Firstly, we've got a data protection issue, and secondly, a discrimination issue. So employers need to consider why they need evidence of vaccination, whether it's appropriate for the business, whether this will require anything more than a simple yes or no. So an assessment is going to need to be carried out in this regard. So a reasonable employer will want to understand why an employee has made a decision not to have a vaccine, but therefore requiring that detail might then pose them at more of a risk from a discrimination perspective. There's also the possibility, as we're seeing, of a national requirement, and obviously various test events are taking place at the moment to see whether there might be some kind of immunisation passport in the future. So it's going to be, again, reviewing the potential data protection issues, privacy, discrimination, and obviously any kind of national measures as a whole as guidance changes in the next coming months. So moving on to our last slide, what does all of this mean for employers? So employers will need to consider vaccination as part of their risk assessments. That's a given. And so they therefore should be encouraging their employees to get vaccinated as soon as it's possible for them to do so. If an employer intends to mandate a vaccine policy as part of its approach to reducing risk, it is going to be open to discrimination claims. There's no doubt about that. So they will therefore need to consider whether there are reasonable alternatives. And this should be explored when they conduct their risk assessment. Employers should also be careful not to stereotype or judge any of their employees. Just because an employee is part of a religious group, for example, doesn't automatically mean that they're going to refuse the vaccination, and therefore you shouldn't assume this. Equally, employers should not assume that the reason for someone's refusal is what the employer perceives as their religion or disability. So it's important that you're not making any of these perceptions. Vaccination policies, however, could potentially be objectively justified as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, which would be the health and safety in the workplace. And there may be ways of achieving this that are going to be dependent in the way that they are operated and the impact on any individual. So a policy, for instance, which allows employees to return to the office only if they have been vaccinated and leaves others working at home could well be justifiable. However, the legitimacy of the employee's aims and whether the policy is appropriate are questions which might well vary over the time. For example, once herd immunity is established, it's going to be harder to then justify not making any exceptions for those who object to vaccinations. At present, we're obviously still some time away from the vaccination being available to all employees, and these questions will therefore need to be reconsidered at that time as circumstances change. And I think we are now got some time to take some questions.
Thank you, Samantha. That was very useful and informative.
Thank you.
There's a couple of questions that have been asked. So Ellie has asked, should flexible working apply to someone who works on a reception and needs to be in the office to answer the door and phones?
Okay, I mean, I think that there's obviously going to be some roles where flexible working on the face of it isn't going to be appropriate, but to ensure fairness, it's important that your policies are open for everyone to apply at least, and then it would be a case of the employer looking at whether that is possible at all, whether, you know, it's probably going to depend on technologies, whether you operate some kind of rota, so if you have cover for staff that they can alternate between sort of a day on the front desk and a day remote taking calls, but it's important that the application process is essentially open for any way that they can apply, even if it isn't feasible for them.
Brilliant, thank you. I hope that answers your question, Ellie. Another question from Sarah. How do you deal with employees who have been vaccinated and want to come into the office but feel unsafe because others in the office may not be vaccinated and they don't know who they are? Is there not a health and safety obligation for the employer?
Yeah, so as we touched on sort of in the final couple of slides, so there is obviously an obligation on the employer to provide a safe place of work under the Health and Safety Act. And I imagine this is going to be a concern for a lot of employees coming back into the office, that even though that they might have had the vaccination, obviously we know that there's potentially some issues in terms of transmission that we still don't know. That vaccine obviously stops you getting COVID to a worse effect, but it might not stop transmission, and that's something that we're not going to know for some time yet. So It's all going to come down to the employer's risk assessment. So, and as we said, some people are going to object to the vaccine for their own reasons, and it's a case of what measures you then put in place to protect not only them but the rest of the workforce as well. So it's a case of whether you say you leave them at home, but obviously that might be okay in the short term, but over the long term, when things evolve and change, it might not be fair to keep them excluded from the business. So it's all going to come down to your risk assessment, whether you keep those safety measures in place. And obviously, as government guidance changes, we'll probably know more then in terms of masks and social distancing and those kinds of things. So it's important to remember that just because people have had the vaccine doesn't mean you then ease up on all of the other steps that you're taking anyway. So as long as your risk assessment reflects that you can gauge what risks there are in terms of the vaccine, those who have had it and not, and what you're doing as a business to still protect your staff as if they hadn't had the vaccine almost.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I hope that deals with that question, Sarah. That's it. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.